The room was quiet, but not calm. It was the kind of silence that came from expectation, not peace. A congressional hearing, halfway full, cameras already recording, staffers staring without blinking. Kash Patel sat alone at the witness table, hands still, eyes steady, the weight of the room pressing down but never touching him. He had been in these rooms before. He had answered questions crafted to trap, not to clarify. And he had learned long ago that the loudest voices were not always the ones in control. Across from him sat Senator Chris Van Hollen, confident, prepared, and smiling the way people smile when they believe the outcome is already written. Van Hollen adjusted his microphone. "Mr. Patel," he said, his tone measured, "thank you for agreeing to testify. I trust you understand the seriousness of today's hearing." Kash nodded. "I do." Van Hollen glanced at the audience, not Kash. "Well, some of your past statements have certainly been bold. Let's hope today we can separate facts from politics." There was no laughter, but the implication lingered. Kash did not react. He sat with the posture of someone who knew the difference between speaking and being heard. Van Hollen began. He asked about reports, timelines, statements Kash had made during his time in government. He asked questions with sharp corners, the kind that were designed to imply more than they revealed. But Kash answered each one the same way, clearly, directly, without flinching. At first, Van Hollen appeared relaxed. But as Kash continued to speak without retreat, something in the senator's tone began to tighten. "So you're telling us," Van Hollen said, "that the intelligence community, the Department of Justice, and multiple oversight bodies all misrepresented key facts, and you, alone, had the truth?" Kash looked at him, not with defiance, but with precision. "No," he said. "I'm saying the truth was available to anyone willing to look. But not everyone was." The room shifted, not with noise, but with awareness. Several staffers lowered their pens. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, not louder. Van Hollen pressed forward. "You've made some strong claims in the press, claims about classified material, about abuse of power, even about this committee. Are you prepared to stand by every word?" "I don't make claims," Kash said. "I make statements backed by evidence. And I'm prepared to stand by all of them." The senator paused. His next question was slower. "In your opinion, Mr. Patel, what is the greatest threat to public trust in government today?" Kash waited a moment before answering. "The belief," he said, "that truth is decided by those in charge." There it was. The first crack in the format. Van Hollen's pen stopped moving. His face held the same expression, but the silence around him had changed. The kind of change that didn't announce itself, but couldn't be ignored. He leaned forward. "So you believe this committee has misled the public?" Kash did not blink. "I believe this committee has chosen which facts to emphasize and which to ignore. And I believe the public deserves better than selective transparency." It was not an accusation. It was a mirror. And for the first time in the hearing, Senator Van Hollen did not respond immediately. He shifted in his chair. His fingers tapped once against the desk. The rhythm of control was faltering, not because Kash had disrupted it, but because Kash had refused to play along. The senator tried to steer back. "Well, perhaps we'll get to the bottom of that today," he said. Kash nodded once. "I'm ready when you are." For a moment, nothing happened. No gavel, no laughter, just a quiet room, and two men sitting across from each other, one asking questions, the other refusing to give up the ground of quiet truth. And somewhere in that stillness, the hearing changed. Not with a headline, but with a tone. Because it had become clear that Kash Patel had not come to protect himself. He had come to reveal something. And Senator Van Hollen was beginning to realize that the next question he asked might be the one that changed the entire room. The room did not move, but it listened differently now. Senator Van Hollen flipped to a new page in his binder, the movement small but telling. He was searching for something. A rhythm, a foothold, something that would let him pull the attention back toward his side of the table. But Kash Patel sat without shifting, without fidgeting, like a man who had already seen this play before. "Mr. Patel," Van Hollen said finally, "you've been vocal about your concerns regarding politicization inside intelligence agencies. Would you care to share what evidence, if any, supports that claim?" Kash Patel looked directly at him. "There are communications. emails, internal memos, testimonies from officials who were pushed to adjust findings to match political narratives. I've submitted them to this committee. Van Hollen leaned back. Yes, you submitted them. And yet, conveniently, much of your evidence is redacted or tied to non-public sources. Kash did not answer right away. Instead, he opened the folder in front of him and removed a single sheet of paper. This is a transcript, he said, of an internal meeting from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It's not classified, but it hasn't been referenced in your materials. Van Hollen frowned. We choose what's relevant, Mr. Patel. Kash slid the paper forward. You chose what was convenient. That was the moment something changed. Not just in the room, in the posture of the staffers, in the tension held in the backs of the people seated behind the senators. They were no longer watching a routine hearing. They were watching a power struggle unfold one sentence at a time. Van Hollen reached for the paper, glanced at it, then set it aside. So let's be honest, he said, voice sharper now. You're here to create a narrative, to undermine this committee and feed conspiracy theories to the public. Kash's voice did not rise. I'm here, he said, because the public deserves to know how narratives are created when evidence is ignored. For a second, the air felt like glass, clear, but under pressure. The senator narrowed his eyes. Are you accusing me of hiding evidence? I'm stating, Kash said calmly, that the information you've chosen to highlight excludes material that contradicts your conclusions. That's not oversight. That's agenda. That was the sentence that tipped it. Senator Van Hollen's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. He looked not just surprised, he looked seen. And in a room like that, being seen too clearly can feel like being cornered. He recovered. You're implying that I have some personal motive here, he said. That I'm not just a public servant, but something else. What exactly is your allegation, Mr. Patel? Kash didn't lean in. He didn't raise his voice. He simply answered. You've introduced 3 bills in the last year based on conclusions that omit data from this committee's own files. You've given over a dozen interviews where you claimed definitive evidence without disclosing what you excluded. And just last week, you held a fundraiser using this hearing's talking points before the hearing even happened. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. Somewhere behind the senators, someone dropped a pen. Van Hollen cleared his throat, but the words came slower now. Those are public records. There's nothing hidden about that. Kash nodded. That's true. But context matters. And when that context shows a pattern of narrative control, of selective outrage, of pre-scripted conclusions, it stops being public service and starts becoming something else. The senator blinked once. So you're here to accuse me of corruption. I'm not accusing you of anything, Kash said. I'm just reading aloud the parts of the record you left out. Someone in the back coughed. But no one laughed. Because no one was sure what this was anymore. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't a cross-examination. It was a slow unmasking. And no one, not even Van Hollen, could pretend it wasn't happening. The senator adjusted his tie. You're dangerously close to slander, Mr. Patel. Kash Patel looked at him without blinking. And you're dangerously close to proving my point. The room did not erupt. It did not gasp or cheer. It held still. Because in that moment, no reaction would have matched what was unfolding. Van Hollen looked down at his notes, but his hands were no longer still. And then, in a voice trying to reclaim control, he said, You know what, Mr. Patel? I think we've heard enough from you today. Kash closed his folder. Unfortunately for you, he said quietly, the country hasn't. And that was the moment Congress shifted. Not because of a headline, but because the silence that followed was the sound of truth being heard by people who were never supposed to listen. The hearing should have moved on. Another witness was scheduled. Another senator had questions. But for several long seconds, no one spoke. No one reached for the microphone. Because Kash Patel had done something that did not fit the script. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't accused. He had simply laid out what others weren't willing to say, and done it so calmly that no one could look away. Senator Van Hollen took a sip of water. But even that small movement felt defensive now. His notes, once an asset, now looked like something to hide behind. The air in the chamber no longer belonged to him. The committee chair tapped the microphone. We will now move to the next line of questioning. But it was too late. The shift had already happened. The next senator, an ally of Van Hollen, tried to regain rhythm. Mr. Patel, she began, you speak of context. But context can be manipulated. How do we know that your version of events is not just another partisan framing? Kash Patel folded his hands on the table. Because I'm not asking anyone to believe my version. I'm asking them to read the documents that were never shown. That sentence lingered. The senator tried to press further. And what makes you think those documents were left out with intent, not simple oversight? Kash answered without pause. Because they weren't just omitted. They were marked irrelevant before they were even reviewed. That quiet statement held weight. It didn't accuse a crime. It revealed a process. A process where narrative came before evidence. Where summary replaced scrutiny. Where trust was lost, not all at once, but detail by quiet detail. The senator hesitated. You seem very sure of your interpretation. Kash nodded. I've seen what happens when committees like this stop asking questions and start writing conclusions before testimony begins. There was no anger in his voice. Just memory. Across the room, staffers exchanged quiet glances. Phones buzzed silently on laps. One aide opened a news alert, then closed it just as fast. The hearing was trending, and the clips were already circulating. But inside the room, there was no performance. Only something that felt like reckoning. Senator Van Hollen, still seated, leaned into his microphone. So what now, Mr. Patel? Are you calling for an investigation? A hearing into this hearing? Kash looked at him. I'm calling for honesty. The sentence was too simple to dismiss. I'm not here to win a headline, he continued. I'm here because somewhere between these walls and the press release, the American people stopped hearing the full story. That was when the murmurs began. Not loud, not disruptive, just enough to be real, just enough to show that the room was no longer sealed. The chair leaned forward. We asked that the gallery remain silent. But silence was already losing. Because outside the hearing, networks had picked up the footage. Analysts were pausing frame by frame. The moment where Van Hollen froze. The moment Kash laid down the transcript. The moment a hearing stopped being managed and started being remembered. Inside the room, the chair tried to move on. Unless there are any further questions, this session will adjourn. Van Hollen, still sitting, gave no objection. But the look on his face had changed. The certainty was gone. The script was gone. And the optics he had counted on, those two, were slipping. Kash stood quietly. No victory speech. No defiance. He simply gathered his notes and nodded toward the committee. Thank you for your time. The gavel struck once. But even that sound didn't feel final. Because what had happened couldn't be ended with a closing line. As Kash walked out of the chamber, the cameras waiting outside didn't capture a man who had gone on offense. They captured a man who had simply told the truth in a room that had spent too long avoiding it. Later that night, Van Hollen's office released a brief statement. We stand by the integrity of today's hearing and thank Mr. Patel for his testimony. But the words landed flat. Because the audience had already seen the footage. They had heard the tone. And no amount of wording could undo what they had already felt. On cable shows, anchors debated the fallout. Was Patel grandstanding? Was Van Hollen caught unprepared? But viewers didn't argue about the politics. They talked about the shift. About the moment when a witness turned the hearing back into what it was supposed to be, a search for truth, not control. Kash Patel gave no follow-up interviews that week. No op-eds. No press tours. Just one short statement posted online. When the evidence speaks, the headlines don't matter. It was shared over 4 million times. Not because it was loud, but because it was quiet and true. And in a town full of sound, that's what people had forgotten how to hear.